1992. You are on.
I was saying that I find it interesting that there was that period when a lot of people were writing about it. And a lot of those people had been in the folk revival for a while and had seen it taken away from them. Here's a scenario, a real event. In 1955, I was at Oakland College. There was a lot of folk music underground still. We were bohemians. The word beat wasn't around there. Nothing just after I went through. And the folk music, the folk singing gravitated around the two student co-ops, particularly Greg Gables. In the lounge of Greg Gables, I was playing the guitar and other people. One day, Linda Snyder was in Brooklyn and had grown up in the folk revival in New York City. Her cousin is Elliot Adnett Boyce. Elliot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what happened to Linda Snyder. She came running into the lounge of Greg Gables, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had just heard Lonnie Donegan's million-seller Rock Island Line. She said, "They've taken Rock Island Line away from us. What will they take next? Midnight Special?" It was graphic. It was real. I mean, we stopped singing.
Terrific. Our film can do for this what the Civil War film did for all those strange guys running around in blue uniforms on weekends.
Right. Well, anyway, there were a lot of people who, like Sandy Payton and so on, who were thoughtful, intelligent people, not necessarily academics at all, but in the folk revival in one way or the other. And they had to come to grips with what was happening and relate what they had been doing and were continuing to do underground, let's say, with what was going on in the Hickerson Trio at all, and making folk music a household word like stuff like it. And so there were a lot of articles around that time in Sing Out, Caravan, and whatnot, Little Sandy Review. Then it sort of petered out. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, it's sort of come again, I think, partly because it's historical now.
Yes.
Nostalgia. I think some of the younger people might be getting into it because they were raised. Their families were in the folk revival. I don't know. But all of a sudden, things are surfacing. I mean, events like that conference, the Richard Royce Memorial Conference.
Right.
Ron Cohen.
Well, Ron Cohen.
Right.
Now. And Ron is writing a book.
Right. Well, there's another book coming out. Neil Rosenberg is editing a group of essays. I guess that's University of Illinois. So the subject has come of age. More people are really interested in it. The thing that fascinates me is that even with some of my sanest and most beloved colleagues, the mindsets of the revival seems to be the late 50s, early 60s, what others call the folk music boom, and people have called the folk music scare. I've heard that phrase.
Yes.
And I'm sort of a gadfly. I was a gadfly at that conference. I say, but wait a minute, what about all this stuff? My image, my metaphor is that sometime in the mid-30s, folk song revival, the revival with folk song and folk dance goes back to England around the turn just after the turn of the century. Cecil Sharp, they used the term. And like here, it wasn't a revival, it was a transplant. They were taking rural music and putting it into schools. Come on, let's all sing these arrangements of folk song. Let's all do these Morris dances. It wasn't reviving their own.
Right.
Of course, a smaller, more homogeneous country, the more you can think of it's our own. But in our country, you're taking Delta Blues, the kids in New York City were taking the guitar and taking Appalachian banjo. People from Detroit were picking up the banjo, playing banjo tunes. I'm from New Haven. I was playing the guitar. But sometime in the mid-30s, for various reasons, the New Deal, the Library of Congress, the Lomaxes, John and Al Lomax affiliated here starting in 33, although the archive goes back to 28, and particularly Al Lomax. Bringing songs and authentic folk singers into contact with these young people like Pete Seeger, the Northern City kids, who wanted to learn these songs. And Alan Lomax and others would say, hey, here's Woody Guthrie, get together. Here's a great song, Girl. Alan Lomax particularly had radio shows, 39, 40, 41, 42, and then later also. What do you get all these guys? They were doing farm songs. Try this song, Girl. You know, the Jimmy Crack Corn, I Don't Care, not the Amos theme song, and so on and so forth. As a kind of an activity where you can trace a history, continue with a continuity, it starts in the mid-30s. And all the different aspects of the folk revival you can see being picked up in those early days. People sitting around singing songs in the living room or whatever, the lounge of the dorm. Heck, we have a recording made in 1937, November 1937. Alan Lomax took the disc recorder out to the home of Charles and Ruth Seeger in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And there were a bunch of people. Bess was there, and most of them worked with Charles Seeger in the Resettlement Administration. And there they were, swapping verses, taking turns on verses, and all singing the chorus of Cindy and Skip Memory. I mean, there it is, right there in 1937. You know, just one of the basic elements of the underground activity, the folk song revival. Topical songs. Why write songs? Well, from the beginning, you had these northern city kids in contact with folk, authentic folk, who wrote songs. Woody Guthrie and Molly Jackson. They all did that. You know, they rewrote old songs. It became second nature. So, of course, when the folk boom occurred, songwriting, topical songs, was a part of it, because it had always been part of folk revival. Well, anyway, it's a topic that's coming of age.
One of the questions I always, the political side of folk music, so that's part of it.
There seems to be a lot of criticism. I mean, there are people that seem to simply think topical song doesn't belong there. I don't know if you've heard that, and I don't understand it, quite frankly, looking back at it now and looking at Woody Guthrie. But particularly as I read a lot about the early 60s, there were Little Sandy Review, I read things in which they would simply trash the protesty people.
Yeah, there were those that preferred other kinds of songs and not protest songs. And some just for preference, and others had a cause of their own, I guess. They wanted songs that had been around a while, and styles that had been around a while, not newfangled songs.
Or not I get a sense of not people sitting down and composing these things. That was somehow bad or not legitimate.
We're not folk music, not what people...
Well, we're not folk music,
yeah.
and...
Right. Yeah, you get that kind of conflict. You know, you get the conflict of style, performance style. Do we sing it like they did, or do we sing it any old way?
That is...
Who on a mass scale first began working to bring rural performers up to the city to perform in places like Newport or Chicago? Who were the movers in that? I think Ralph was one.
Yeah, Ralph certainly. Yeah, you have the efforts of the board of the Newport,
Yeah.
you know, where you had the popular folk singers who knew their roots and were concerned. I mean, they weren't calling themselves folk singers. They realized that they weren't folk singers. They didn't know what the market called them. They were singers of folk songs. So, getting these people on the board, they were influential in starting to bring these people to Newport. But University of Chicago Folk Festival was doing the same thing. You can do a little research to find out who came first or what the crossover and the connection was. Certainly those two, Newport and University of Chicago Festival. In fact, University of Chicago Festival sort of became a showcase for traditional performers to the exclusion of the modern performers, whereas Newport was always a mix.
Have you read any thoughts as to why the Kingston Trio then and the boom taking off in its wake as opposed to? I asked Fred Hellerman when we saw him last week why the Weavers in 1950 didn't do it. And he said, I don't know. And I think that's as legitimate as anybody else because nobody. I asked this question.
Well, they
all the
didn't do
time,
it then because of blacklisting.
Well, yeah.
I think one of the reasons, not in terms of cultural, but in terms of the history of the revival, another one of my scenarios. Of course, Pete Seeger was an individual performer, but then he joined with the Weavers, and they did a lot of performing up through early 1952 when they couldn't get any more jobs. And Pete went back to solo performing. And, you know, he was eking out a living. He was doing a fair amount of performing and making records for Morass. But, you know, they were mostly performing, he was mostly performing for the, what I would call the northern city left-wing axis. You know, New York City, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, you know, left-wing causes a lot. And some of those were less nothing or benefit. Then one day, an occasional college or university like Cornell that was kind of nearby. Then one day, two New York City folk revivalists who went to Oberlin, Mike Horowitz and the late Kent Seiden. They were seniors. They were juniors. I was a freshman. It was my freshman year, 1953, 54. They persuaded Pete Seeger to drive out to this unknown little co-ed college in the Midwest, Oberlin, and they guaranteed him $100. And Pete was real nervous about this. He didn't know. Going all the way out there for this one concert. He wasn't the only one that was nervous. Kent Seiden and Mike Horowitz. Mike Horowitz is an anthropologist who's been freelancing. Kent Seiden founded and for years ran the guitar workshop in Long Island and died relatively young age, about 5 years ago. Anyway, Mike and Kent were quite nervous themselves. They had to get a campus sponsor, so they got SDA or SDS or whatever it was that year. To sponsor, it was in a 200-seat auditorium, the Allen Art Museum. And darn if they didn't just about fill it. And they made all their expenses and paid Pete $100. It was a great concert. I mean,
You went to the concert?
Yeah, I went to the concert. It was the first time I had really seen Pete Seeger. I saw him at a Wallace Taylor Progressive Party rally in 1948. The only thing I remember was the louder he sang, the louder, more vigorously he stamped his foot. That's all I remember at that point. But by then I was familiar with the Weavers, and I was picking up a lot of songs. And then the thing about that really influenced me in folk music was the fact that I ended up going to Oberlin. And instead of just a few friends, I had no relationship with the folk music scene anywhere in New York City or anywhere else. But then all of a sudden, there are these double handful of kids from New York City and Detroit and Chicago with guitars. Not just guitars, but people's songs, the People's Songbook. The second one wasn't out yet. And the latest issue, Sing Up. So there I was, grabbing those things. And then there was a guy on campus who sold folkways. So he was a rep for all the folk music record companies in the United States. 3. Right? Folkways, Stinson, and the brand new Electric. Steve Toller was his name. And he became the impresario for concerts. He sold the records. He sort of organized sings, and he had the radio show. And when he graduated, I got all that stuff. Passed on to him. But here's how it spread at Oberlin. Pete came, my freshman year there were 200 people. Next year, 500. My junior year, 750. My senior year, 1,000 people. I mean, this is a campus population of 2,000, a town of 5,000. But see, people were coming from Antioch, from all these other colleges to see Pete Seeger. Bill Crowfoot, I don't know if you've heard of him. Addison Crowfoot, quite popular in the 60s. He still performed. He came over to visit his girlfriend from Allegheny College. Got struck by Pete Seeger and people evangelized. Pete has said in his book and in person, I did an oral history interview of him one year at Mariposa. And I asked him about Oberlin. He said better. He said that getting that job at Oberlin was a turning point. He had broken out of it, not his words, but what I describe as the northern city left-wing axis. And he started getting campus jobs, colleges and universities. He hooked up with a guy named Paul Endicott, who was his manager, a guy from Detroit. and he was doing all these colleges and universities. Well, that coupled with the fact that the Weavers had their great reunion, I was there. You can hear me applauding for a second now. Those records. And the fact that Pete was proselytizing and singing in all these campuses, not just in the cities, means that more and more college students were getting into folk music. And not just as fans, but as singers, and not just as solo singers, but like the Weavers, small ensembles. So we had the Folksmiths at Oberlin. We made a record for the last year. Yeah, Folksmiths. I went to IU. We had the Settlers. But all these groups. And the Kingston Trio was one of them. They were all college dropouts at the time, but they were doing the same thing. So, like the Weavers in the 50s, just some fortuitous circumstances got them the gig and then the contract with Capitol. And it wasn't until their second release that it hit. Their first release bombed. I think it was one of those Calypso things. Another interesting thing about the revival is the Calypso element. I think the Calypso element comes in through the IDE from the 20s and 30s because the wealthy Yaleys, Harvard, all those guys would go to Nassau for their vacations. And so they picked up these songs, these so-called Calypso songs from Blind Blake, Alphonse Higgins, from his nightclub stuff on his records, and they'd be part of the Whiffen Poop repertoire. You augmented seven. If you didn't make the Whiffen Poops, then you made the augmented seven. You know, that tier of groups, you know. And all these different colleges had made vacation in Nassau, so of course, by then in '55, you had the Calypso craze. So there was Kingston Trio just doing like we all did in other places. God damn it, they did. Okay. All right, so we had to stop singing or find another version, which we did. So why did that stick? Well, I think by then there were a number of people in the audience because of the underground folk song revival that were tuned with. When I left Oberlin, it was '57. Folk singing was still, even within Oberlin, was an underground activity. It was associated with the co-ops. It was associated with bohemian. That was the word. The two co-ops, student co-ops, you didn't have to wear a tie to them.
Okay.
The deans didn't like that.
So you were the beatniks.
Yeah, a year before.
Right.
So there were, if you had a folk sing, you could count on, the usual handful of people, maybe at the most. And of course, Pete Seeger was building an audience there. He was the only one. And I went back for my 5th reunion, and I was visiting a friend. I wasn't even aware I happened to be in Oberlin that weekend. So my friend Doug says, "Hey, come on, let's go over to what's dormitory, our 5th anniversary." He said, "Like that, it's going to be all those Y types. There's not going to be anybody from the co-ops there. There wasn't more than about 5 from the co-ops." But still, I took my guitar, and they all said, "Oh, Joe, let's sing." All these people never came to folk sings. All the college students they were aware of Pete Seeger, and it wasn't their activity, but now it was.
Was Electra begun as a commercial enterprise, or did Jack Holtzman, I forget his partner's name, although it's come up, I didn't know it.
Alan Keith News.
Right, Alan Keith News.
Jack Holtzman's younger brother, Don, was a classmate of mine, but he had nothing to do with this.
Okay, so
Until he found he could become a vice president of Electra.
was it begun out of love to be in other folkways? Was it begun as something that he thought might catch a wave? And
Kenny could tell you about that. I think Kenny was involved. Well, I think the first record he put out was poetry. He told me once that he recorded some guy reading poetry, and just nothing. So he just took a carton of those records out East River and dumped them. But somehow, at that time there were only 2 folk music companies. That was, besides Library of Congress, and that was that company. You had Folkways and you had Stinson. And they put out records with any kind of quality in terms of recorded sound. Jack Holtzman was an engineer, I guess, or was conversant with equipment. And his idea was to issue some of these people, but in the highest melody.
sort of like Cook from Stanford, right? Put out
Right.
high fidelity
Yeah.
recordings of steam trains, earthquake tremors. So it was, the idea was not just to record folk music, but high quality recordings, and they were specialists. They were
Very
experienced
different from what was out
Yeah,
prior to that.
Yeah, folk plays, Stinson especially, were hit or miss, scratchy surface notes.
So do you think part of this also was technology? I mean, we had the fact that now people have record players, more and more people have record players with all this use, and so they needed to fill up. I don't know. This is just a
We had a long talk with
without-
somebody. It was Archie
Who's Archie?
Gray, whose theory is that using electronic age allowed the revival to take off. I don't know. It's his theory, a theory.
Well, I don't know, 57 to 61, what were general record sales like? There were more records being sold.
Yeah, I wanted to
Inordinately
Yeah.
more in general? I don't know.
What I've read what has led me to believe there was in many quarters an extreme reaction to the Kingston Trio, and we've come across some just some hysterical looking album covers issued in the wake of the Kingston Trio. The four preps and all of the what they called the Pepsid and Smiled characters. Were there real stratifications developing within the
Well, first of all, I mean, with the Kingston Trio having such an effect, had such an effect on the industry. Every company wanted to have their folk act.
Yeah.
And a lot of them took ready-made folk acts, like the Highwaymen were singing around Wesleyan or whatever. Others were molded or auditioned into place, like Peter, Paul, and Mary. And interestingly, the one stylistic aspect of the Kingston Trio that made them quite different from Weavers was their vocal timbre, their types of voices. They had three like voices. They blended. The Weavers were four totally different voice types. But that was very important. It became very important. I mean, that's why Al Grossman or Milt Oaken, wanted to get three voices, not just birds, melted together.
Merge was into Tom Paxton's story.
He told us
I don't know if you have heard this. He said his first 2 weeks in New York, he was auditioned by Milt Oaken for a slot in the Chatterton Trio. And he said he was told that he got it. And he was told a week later that they decided he didn't have it because his voice didn't blend. And he said he was crushed. And it took him 5 years to get signed to Elektra.
I know, and he said that was like one of the most devastating times in his life, though, because here he was, he was a customer, and it's like, you have it, he's so excited.
Well, the interesting thing was that he made it because he said, I was playing in the clubs for 2 weeks when I got cued into this audition, and I was told I got it. It's
That's what you said about the blending of his voice.
And he said a week later I was told I didn't have it.
Thanks, Mel.
What is...
Lots of little vignettes like that.
Oh, those are the kind of interesting stories that make also him a little more
What is here?
Dick Sari, Dick Sari, Dick Sari?
No.
Dick Sari. Dick Sari is a disc jockey in the Washington area. He's had a program called Musical Americana since about when I came here in '63. He may have had it slightly before. But he was playing then, he still plays the popular folk music of the 60s, and the early 60s, late 50s. He's revived it here. He's formed the World Folk Music Association, which is basically him. He puts out a newsletter, folk news. But you look at the roster of what he talks about. It's the same as those people that put out the Kingston Corner stuff out in Ellen Shaw, out in Illinois. It's all Kingston Trio and that sort of stuff, which helps them have their revival. Anyway, Dick Sari showed a film. It was film footage of the. I remember that it had a very young John Denver in it. It's kind of narrated. It was Peter, Paul, and Mary at the Cellar Door. It was a long-term popular nightclub for focus. And John Denver narrated it, and it was never shown. So about a year ago, Dick Sari had it shown at international.
We're looking, we need all of this footage.
Oh, yeah,
We're looking for anything that we can find that was actually filmed like this. Lots of potential sources for still photos, but it's hard to find so far.
You know about the 2 volumes of the film index that was compiled by the Center for Southern Folklore?
Yeah.
Film? Yeah. don't know if they're still available. They published the first volume, and then Bowker in New York published the second volume. They came out about 15 years ago. They have an awful lot of stuff, really folk stuff, videos and films. The second one is in as well indexed as the first. And I don't know for sure, but they may have been keeping track. The Center for Southern Folklore still exists in Memphis, and they may be keeping a card file of
Okay.
the calls will update that.
Other sources of film or still photographs that strike you?
Well, there's a motion picture division, to get at. Stills, we have stills, and the picture photograph division has stills. And the music division has photograph division. We have a rough index of our photos. An intern was working on a similar thing for the videos. I don't know what, I've not seen a printout of it, but there ought to be something there that's accessible. Because what's in the photograph division, most picture division, have to use their indexes.
Right.
So certainly those are Center for Southern Folklore, I certainly check it out, particularly about possible update of the index.
About people, who would you see as people who are essential to talk to with respect to the project? I'm sure you didn't give me names that you've not talked to or never heard of, so that's why I asked.
Alan Lorenz, that's one that's Hollis, Keith Seaver.
So Alan talks to people. I mean, we okay,
Really?
that's fine. I mean, that's what we need to know.
That's,
That's what we need
I
to
don't
know.
know.
Because,
He's really just within a sentence.
because we,
Spent 15 minutes with him talking. But he says that.
Okay, that's not a problem.
I mean, he's more, I didn't realize how essential he was until I came to work here. It's not just the collections that they amass, it's what they and he did with, even more so than his father, did with it. Radio and Hickerson and organizing concerts. My brother.
we will keep us in touch. Yeah.
That'll know you. I mean, we're going to, we're just going to go on for several weeks.
Okay, you got Ralph, you got Archie.
Thank you also.
I'll try Jack.
Yeah, we're gonna have it.
Yeah, we're going to have
Hawaii or something?
Pardon me?
How about Hawaii?
No,
He's in the LA area.
Yeah.
Well, Ron Cohen, I don't know. Is Ron Cohen coming to you?
Oh, no, no, no.
Okay.
Right.
New York and
Oh, that's
Right,
right.
right,
You got
right.
it. Okay, you were right.
Ron came up to see us in San Francisco. He was just
That's right. No, we had seen him earlier.
Oh, I thought he was
Before,
on that trip. Okay.
He had a funny story about that. He went to Jack's home. And it's a marvelous place to kind of, substantial. I guess. I don't know. I was searching. I was saying against intimidating. I don't know Ron was intimidated, but it was substantial. He's sitting there looking at this art on the wall. People like that. He excused himself down after. I don't know. He would sit around this room, look around. It was substantial. And then Jack came back and sat down. He said he was very gracious. He said he for 30 minutes I talked really fast. Asked the first question.
Norm Cohen.
Good job. Set up very good. Yeah, we've got it.
One thing that lacks is a good representation of everybody. I mean, so much happened in the boom that people just overlook what was happening elsewhere. I mean, a lot of things happened in folk revival reaction to the boom. Particularly, a lot of folk song clubs, organizations came to fruition, who were organized or came to fruition during that period of time. And in a way, they react. For example, 1964, I came here in 63 already. There were 3 full-time nightclubs that opened. Every night the concert was there. Well, it was really interesting. Body Dots and Eddie Dots. I go, stay up there. Time to come in, do the concert and everything. But the people who were in the folk scene here were just struggling with that. Sure, they went to some of the shows, but what about, they wanted to nurture and spread what they were doing, formal music into songs that other people were doing, styles that other people were doing. They wanted to bring people to concerts that weren't getting done there. So, like in many other places, I always found it. Part of our philosophy for that kind of football concert is that important. But we would have events that were research put together, have events that we would spread the word of what we thought was good, and provide a couple of concerts that would That started in 7500. Well, we folk songs like come and go.